Where do you call home? Where do you feel at home? It's a simple enough question, but for many of us, perhaps most of us, the answer is anything but simple. We commonly refer to our dwelling places as home, yet I know people whose sense of being at home is only loosely connected to the place where they hang their hat, as the old expression goes. When I was working for the Unitarian Universalist Association, I lived much of the year out of my suitcase. So much so that my body was never fully acclimated to this city's weather in either the depths of winter or the sunny days of summer. Among Unitarian Universalist ministers, I'm unusual, almost unique, in that I live 2 miles from the house where I grew up. That's as far away as I've ever been able to get. My permanent residence has always been in what is now Winnipeg, although my first 11 years, the part of the city where I lived and where I continue to live was a separate city of its own. And its residents took great pains to distinguish themselves from those people in Winnipeg. It is in this city that I went to school, attended university, and completed my theological training for the ministry. For the better part of 25 years, I lived with the assumption that the next year would take my family and me away from Winnipeg. Although there were 3 or 4 occasions when I came close to leaving the city, in the end, I managed to stay put. I estimate that the cumulative amount of time I spent on the road for the denomination amounts to 7 or 8 years. So while this city has been home base for my entire life, I've spent a considerable amount of time elsewhere, especially in Boston. And although my home is here in Winnipeg, I can honestly say that I also feel at home in Gimli, in Boston, and in Reykjavik, pretty much in that order. I've lived in 4 different places in Winnipeg, all in the St. James area, and for nearly 20 years, Cindy and I have had the privilege of having a second home north of Gimli. The older I get, the more my sense of being at home seems to be related to the neighborhoods I haunt rather than the houses in which I have lived. And that's why I can say that I feel at home in the Beacon Hill neighborhood of Boston and Midtown Reykjavik, even though I've never owned or rented a home in either place, although the UUA's old guest house in Boston felt like a home away from home. But the fact that I can even say this is an illustration of my privilege. I've never had to worry about having a place to lay my head or hang my hat. I've never had to worry about being warm and comfortable, well-fed and nourished. I feel at home in the universe because the universe has been remarkably kind to me in a way that it is not kind to everyone. The sense of feeling at home in a particular city, town, or neighborhood is grounded upon our familiarity with its terrain, its parks and streets, schools and churches, businesses and other institutions. But it's also related to the web of relationships we have with other people. It's family and friends, neighbors and co-workers whose presence makes us feel as though we are a part of a community. The human aspect of the places where we live. We belong to one another, and that gives us a sense of safety and security, a societal connection to a place, and not just a physical one. Strangely, the more densely populated the area in which we live, the more we may feel isolated from one another if we aren't intentional about cultivating relationships, and the easier it is for the most vulnerable among us to fall through the cracks without anyone noticing, even though they are surrounded by anyone's and everyone's. But there's a more particular sense in which we speak of home, and that does involve the dwellings we inhabit, whether they be houses or apartments, large or small, rented or owned. The diversity of such dwellings reflects our differing tastes and needs, resources and circumstances. And the extent to which the place that each of us calls home satisfies our needs and expectations goes a long way towards determining our sense of well-being. The idea of happiness has always taken material form in the house, whether cottage or castle, remarked Simone de Beauvoir. It stands for permanence and separation from the world. The permanence of our housing lends stability and security to our lives, even if we move from time to time or move frequently. While its separation from the world gives us shelter, even helping to preserve our sanity. A house gives us shelter from the elements, but a home gives us shelter from too much society. We need both. We need a place where we can be warm in winter and cool in the summer, a place where we can be dry when it rains, which we can light up against the darkness, a place where we can store whatever accumulation of stuff we may have acquired without having to watch over it all the time, something that's exhausting. But beyond providing physical shelter, a home also offers emotional shelter. A good home is one where we can feel safe from the cares of the world, where we can enjoy a measure of privacy and keep company with those closest to us, not the whole neighborhood. It is a place of retreat and relaxation, restoration and renewal, where we can unwind and refresh ourselves. It is a shelter from the storms of both nature and society. In his book, Walden, an account of his fleeing life in the town of Concord, Massachusetts, to build a small one-room home of his own along the shore of Walden Pond. A home that is smaller than my office. Henry David Thoreau mentions the word house 266 times, and the word home 57 times. And most of the time, he seems to consider a house to be a burden, warning that one might sometimes wonder whether a person owns a house or the house owns them. This, too, is a measure of privilege, to be able to be so cynical about the house that shelters us from the weather, that shelters us from threat and harm. Thoreau lamented that even in the early 19th century, people were building such lavish houses that they spent most of their lives working to pay off their mortgages and maintain the houses and surrounding property. Boy, if he could see White Ridge today. Yet even this historic housing skeptic recognized the importance of having a home to go to as a place of warmth, of comfort, first of physical warmth, and then the warmth of affections. Although Henry actually had to go home to his mother's house to find the warmth of affections and lunch. Given how important it is for us to have shelter from both nature and society, a place to call home, the plight of homelessness affects the whole fabric of society, and the well-housed who fancy themselves to be comfortable and safe are living in illusion, because every one of us is affected by the consequences of poverty and homelessness, which ultimately cannot be segregated away in the neighborhoods that we think we can avoid. It really is an interdependent web of all existence out there, and we are trapped in that web, whether we know it or not. And the fate of others is the fate that is ultimately ours. Let me acknowledge that homelessness is a complex problem. Many factors are involved: employment or the lack of it, income and wealth, which are actually two separate things, personal background, family circumstances, social networks, mental illness, health care. I could go on and on and on. Homelessness isn't a simple problem, and its solutions won't be simple either. So what I have to say is an oversimplification of an oversimplification of an oversimplification. But my purpose this morning is to motivate thought, not diagnose the problems in detail or offer facile solutions. Neither is particularly helpful. But last night I engaged in a brief experiment. I had intended to do it earlier in the week, but my schedule got away with me. The experiment I engaged in was inspired by a report on the effects of cold upon human well-being, which James Gallagher wrote about at the BBC. Gallagher was invited to participate in an experiment himself that measured how our bodies and minds are affected by being in constant cold. And so, just to get a sense of what it might be like, I turned off the furnace after Cindy was snuggled warm in her under her down comforter. I turned off the furnace. I went to the coolest part of the house just to see how it affected me. The key was to do it for at least 2 hours, and more importantly, to try to sleep in those conditions. And so I need to tell you, I had a really lousy sleep last night, and I'm tired. So even more than I hope you don't fall asleep during the remainder of the sermon, I hope I don't. But I really wanted to experience what James Gallagher was talking about. I wanted to feel it and not just read it. Now, the closest I've come to this before was staying out at the Unitarian camp at Nyssa, which is unheated and, I swear to goodness, colder than the outdoor air when it's cold. On that occasion, I felt my kidneys freezing, even though it was supposedly warm enough weather to be out camping. This was a reminder of that summer excursion in the cold. So what happens to people when they live in constantly cold conditions? Well, our bodies start to change at 18 degrees, which doesn't seem cold at all. Some of us proudly keep our houses at that temperature, although I am not allowed. At 18 degrees, we start to experience physiological changes. But the purpose of this exercise that James Gallagher underwent was to experience a decline to 10 degrees for a sustained period of time. Part of the reason for this experiment was to see the effect that because I want to tell you that most of your neighbors don't give a damn about the homeless when it's 10 degrees. We go out, some of us still with our short sleeve shirts on, maybe a spring jacket. And if we get chilled, we can flee somewhere. So we don't experience 10 degrees the same way that a person without a home does. But at that relatively balmy temperature, or so we think, after a couple of hours, blood flow to the brain falls by 20%. In James Gallagher's case, his breathing went from 9 breaths a minute to 12. His core body temperature did remain at 37 degrees, but it took extra effort. His extremities saw a decline in skin temperature by 2 degrees. Cold hands, cold feet. His blood pressure went up from 99 to 110. His heart rate went from 55 to 65 beats a minute. His body burned more carbs. And when it was all done, a cognition puzzle that he had been able to complete in 75 seconds at 21 degrees took him 95 seconds with the 11-degree difference. Being in constant cool affects everything about us. Our physical well-being, it affects our longevity in life, it affects our ability to think. And yet so many are so quick to judge those who find themselves living at that temperature, not year-round, but when the weather is actually good. It affects the whole person, and it helps to explain why all the solutions, the easy solutions we offer up, don't tend to work when we're dealing with real people living in real life circumstances. A Colorado study a few years ago determined that it costs 2.5 times as much to fund shelters and the whole array of services for the homeless as it would cost to provide permanent housing for them in the first place. So even if society cannot be persuaded to do right by the homeless for the right reasons, out of a sense of decency and simple compassion, perhaps we can motivate people by a sense of stinginess and miserliness to do the right thing. It'll be good for their pocketbooks. As you saw in the centering thought, home is a notion that only nations of the homeless fully appreciate, and only the uprooted comprehend suggested novelist Wallace Stegner. And the sooner we learn to understand the plight of those without adequate housing, the better off everyone will be, ourselves included. We often dismiss the whining of the privileged about minor inconveniences as first world problems. But homelessness as we know it is something of a first world problem, owing to our economic system, which depends upon maintaining a permanent underclass to sustain social and economic privilege, along with zoning and building restrictions that make it impossible for the poor to erect their own homes. In the early years of this city, the neighborhood of Shantytown, which was ironically located where the Canadian Museum for Human Rights now stands, was a place where those of limited means erected humble shanties to house themselves, often made out of second lumber that they scavenged from the city's lumber yards. In our more recent history, Roostertown was a community in the Grant Park neighborhood where Métis citizens did pretty much the same with perhaps advanced building techniques. While the old village of Brooklands sprang up north of St. James and was chartered as a separate municipality precisely to avoid zoning standards that put the homes in nearby Weston out of the reach of working people. Now, I'm not advocating the eliminating of zoning or building codes, but I do think we need to recognize how legal restrictions that serve our expectations and keep our neighborhoods pleasant reduce the choices available to the most vulnerable. And so it is that we ought to also recognize that we should pay the expense that other people bear in order for those zoning regulations and building codes to exist. In most of the traditional cultures of the world, homelessness would be impossible, wrote Lydia Maria Leitala just 3 decades ago. First, because of large protective kin systems, and second, because homes were easily constructed from the materials at hand. We consider homelessness as a lack of shelter, not as a breakdown of community. Of course, homelessness is in fact both a lack of shelter for those who need it and a breakdown in the ideals and social structures that lead us to understand that each and every person is entitled to the basic needs of existence: shelter, food, clothing, and that a decent society provides those basic needs for everyone instead of leaving them entirely at the mercy of market forces. In no economically advanced country does the market system build houses the poor can afford, declared John Kenneth Galbraith in his last book, The Culture of Contentment. It is a fundamental shortcoming of our economic system that the poorest among us must rely on public subsidies for shelter, and it is an even greater shortcoming that for more than 4 decades now, heartless governments in both Canada and the United States have mercilessly cut back on investments in social housing, largely abandoning the construction of affordable housing to private developers and landlords who have no interest in building and maintaining homes that the poor can afford. So for those of us who benefit from the nature of this economy, if we are looking for someone to blame, we need mirrors. And we should probably take them into the voting booth with us. A century and a half ago, Friedrich Engels, who isn't a particularly popular figure among most people in liberal democracies today, Friedrich Engels proposed a solution to the housing crisis that existed then. He observed there are already in existence sufficient buildings for dwellings in the big towns to remedy any real housing shortage, given rational utilization of them. This can naturally only take place by the expropriation of the present owners and by quartering in their houses the homeless or those workers who are excessively overcrowded in their old houses. Now, I realize that any suggestion from Engels is likely to fall on deaf ears, but his choice of words reminds me that just 15 years earlier, my great-great-grandparents left their village in Germany, where they had lived in what was called a quarter house, which was built on a small plot of land that had been carved off from a larger lot. Several of the houses in the village provided homes for 2 or more families. It seems that providing homes for the poor couldn't afford is hardly a new problem in so-called advanced countries. In 19th century Europe, solving its housing crisis happened through immigration. But that strategy is not going to work for us in today's world. It was interesting to me that when Iceland, tiny Iceland, was flooded with immigrants, with refugees from Ukraine, and there wasn't enough housing, they quickly discerned that there were vacant properties around the country, many of them in the form of office buildings, that could be converted into residences to accommodate the number of refugees who were coming to the country. They didn't have an inadequate supply. They just had an inadequate means of distributing the supply that was available. It turns out that one of the solutions to homelessness is similar to one of the solutions to world hunger. In her book, Storming the Gates of Paradise, Rebecca Solnit says, the desire to go home, that is a desire to be whole, to know where you are, to be at the point of intersection of all the lines drawn through all the stars, to be the constellation maker in the center of the world. That center is called love. To awaken from sleep, to rest from awakening, to tame the animal, to let the soul go wild, to shelter in darkness and blaze with light, to seek, to speak, and to be perfectly understood. But love is not enough. We need love that manifests itself as social policy. Love that believes that everyone is as entitled to a place to call home as we believe we are. Love that recognizes we all need to sleep and to awaken from that slumber, to be able to rest upon awakening, to be able to tame life's circumstances, shelter from the darkness, and yes, blaze with light, because we have been given an opportunity to kindle ourselves. Homeless people are not a problem. Homelessness is a problem, and public policy that allows it to continue is beyond a problem. It's a source of evil. Please join in hymn number 318, We Would Be One.